Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to finish up our discussion of Benjamin Franklin's early life, his life in Boston before he decides to move to Philadelphia. The last thing we were talking about was Franklin and deism and his eventual disillusionment with deism. And then the evolution of Franklin's views on religion to the point where he comes to see morality as the most essential part of religious belief. Religion should make you a better person. And he would come to judge various religious faiths based on their ability to make people better. And I told you that this ability to recognize morality in people of different faiths is the cornerstone of a secular society. The way people of different religious faiths can ultimately live together, the way that is possible, is if people are able to recognize, yes, I worship a different God from you, but our morality is sufficiently similar that we can live together in harmony. And Franklin comes to that conclusion, right? And that's an important part of recognizing a secular society. Let's talk a little bit about science. We've already actually discussed a lot of science. Some of Franklin's scientific discoveries, his commitment to science. There's a lot more specific details about Franklin and science in part 3 of the autobiography. I think the thing I want to talk about now is maybe connecting science with the idea of progress. And one of the ways to think about that is Franklin's participation in a lot of 18th century scientific societies. As we get into the 1600s and 1700s, there are a lot more scientific societies that are being created, both in continental Europe, in England, and by the time you're getting into the 1700s, increasingly in the North American colonies. And the growth of scientific societies was an attempt to try and get often isolated scientists working together, communicating with one another, sharing their insights, their scientific discoveries, expressly for the purpose of progress. That if we work together, if we coordinate together, we will advance science, and science will help advance progress. Franklin loved being involved with scientific societies. Frankly, Franklin loved being involved in all kinds of different societies, scientific and non-scientific societies. Franklin was very much a social animal. But Franklin participated in scientific societies in North America, English scientific societies, both in correspondence and sending letters back and forth, but also Franklin would spend a considerable amount of time in his adult life living in England as a trade representative. He was involved with these scientific societies in continental Europe, particularly France, but also in other countries. Franklin would spend years living in France. But his deep involvement in trying to get people together to share their scientific advances, we can really see as part of Franklin's commitment to progress. Okay. Well, let's talk about Benjamin Franklin leaving Boston and heading to Philadelphia. There were a lot of things involved with this decision. It starts with his relationship with his older brother, James. In the beginning, things were fine with James. James was the master, Ben was the apprentice. Ben, in the beginning, had a lot to learn. But by his middle teens, Ben had learned everything he could learn from James. And as we'll talk about more when Ben gets to Philadelphia, one of the things you'll notice is Ben tends not to like having people of authority over him. He's going to chafe with having James as his boss eventually. When he gets to Philadelphia, he's going to get this boss Keimer. We're going to talk about Keimer. Ben would fight Keimer because Ben didn't necessarily like having people above him. Look, this is a dude that's going to become a revolutionary. Okay? Revolutionaries usually have problems with, being under the authority of other people. We're going to see this characteristic manifested in Benjamin Franklin. So Ben and James start fighting a lot. Okay. Now, James had a side business with his printing business. James started the first newspaper in Massachusetts. The newspaper was called the New England Courant, and it was a very nice side hustle for James. See, James had all the printing equipment, so his idea is, why don't I start a newspaper? Today we think about a newspaper being a mainline business and then you buying printing equipment for your newspaper. James thought of it in just the inverse order. It's like, I've got this printing equipment. When it's not operating, why don't I come up with some stories and publish a newspaper? It wasn't a daily or weekly. It was just a semi-periodic newspaper. When things were slow at the printing house, James would print up some copies of stories he had and then sell them. And it turned out to be a very nice side business for James. Now, one of the reasons the newspaper did so well was James was willing to say controversial things about local leaders in Boston and, in fact, the general court in Massachusetts. He was not afraid of doing that. But I will remind you, this was the 1720s we're talking about, the early 1720s. There is no United States of America at this point. There is no Constitution of the United States. There is no Bill of Rights. There is no First Amendment guaranteeing freedom of speech. So to criticize local leaders, colonial leaders, was something of a risk. Okay, now don't get me wrong. There was a fair amount of toleration for critical speech against leaders in Massachusetts. If you had to pick a place in the world to be critical of your leaders, Massachusetts was really one of the better places in the world to do this. But the important point I'm trying to make here is that there was no guarantee of this, like there would be later on when we get to the United States. So James was taking a bit of a risk. And James was warned a few times by local leaders. Hey, this stuff you're writing in the newspaper, you're making us look bad. You should probably cool that. And then James would just persist and continue writing critical things, and he was warned again. Hey, really, we weren't joking. You need to cool it. And he persisted and continued writing things. And then one day he was arrested and thrown into jail. And he was given a few options for getting out of jail. Okay. One option was just simply to stay in jail. You can stay here. Or, local leaders told him, you can sell your newspaper, or you can simply stop publishing your newspaper. Those are your options. Stay in jail, sell the paper, stop printing the paper. James didn't like any of those options. Okay. He obviously didn't want to stay in jail. Selling the newspaper would have been difficult because the reason James could make this work is he owned the printing equipment. So who's he going to sell the newspaper to? There weren't that many printers in Boston. Okay. And he didn't want to stop printing it because it was a nice money maker. So he needed to think of something else. And so James comes up with what he thinks is a clever idea. I will put my little brother Benjamin in charge of the newspaper, at least as far as the colony of Massachusetts is concerned. James would still run the paper in reality, but he would install Ben as the figurehead. He would put Ben's name on the front page of the newspaper, on the masthead. publisher, Benjamin Franklin, but James would really run it. And so he hoped this would satisfy local leaders. Like, okay, I'm not running the paper anymore, my brother is. This brought up a different problem, however. And the other problem was that legally, an apprentice could not run a business like a newspaper. That was against the law. Apprentices were not allowed to have other jobs or own businesses because they were supposed to be solely focused on serving their master. So if James was going to do this, he was going to have to free Ben from his apprenticeship. But Ben was 17 years old, and James had years of free labor from Ben, and he didn't want to free Ben. So once again, James came up with what he considered to be a clever idea. I will create a secret contract with Ben that makes it clear he is still my apprentice, but I will tear up his initial apprenticeship contract. The master could end an apprentice contract. The apprentice could not. So James could tear up the initial contract. Okay, but James had a secret contract, which was going to still obligate Ben to work with him till the age of 21. Okay. James told this series of complicated, deceptive plans to Ben, and Ben said he would go along with it. The problem ultimately for James was Ben was smarter than James. And James was kind of playing checkers here, and Ben was playing chess. When Ben heard about this plan, we can suspect what he heard in this plan was, I'm going to be free pretty soon. Sure enough, James got out of jail, and Ben's name went on the masthead of the New England Courant. And Ben tells us that he determined in his head if James treated him well, he would continue working for James. But if James persisted in what Ben felt like mistreating him, and that's why Ben and James had been fighting a lot recently, is Ben thought James was mistreating him. Ben says in part 1, I thought of him as a brother. He thought of me as a servant. And so Ben says, if he treats me well, I will stay with him. But if not, I'll break my apprenticeship. The first time they get back together, the first time they're in the printing house together, Ben and James have a fight. And Ben just tells James, that's it, I quit, I'm done, I'm not your apprentice anymore, and leaves. Which left James in a very awkward situation. See, this is why Ben was smarter than James. The problem was this idea of a secret contract. See, secret contracts are worthless. Okay? The whole point of a contract is it's a public legal document. If you have a contract and another person involved in the contract violates the contract, the purpose is you could take that legal document to a court of law and say, Judge, do something about this. This guy violated the contract. But if it's a secret contract that you can't show anybody, it's worthless. And Ben understood that, and James didn't. Because if James tried to expose the secret contract, that would mean legally Ben couldn't run the newspaper. And if Ben's not running the newspaper, that means James is running the newspaper, which means he should be in jail. Ben figured this out. Ben knew 3 steps ahead. And so he kind of justified this in his head, like, if my brother treats me well, I will stay as an apprentice. But he was telling himself that to make himself seem like not a bad guy for breaking the apprenticeship. But of course, they fight almost immediately, and Ben quits. So Ben is 17 years old and is no longer is no longer an apprentice. Now, when I told you initially about the nature of an apprenticeship, and I really emphasized to you, look, this was a legally binding contract. I wanted you to appreciate what a big deal it is that Ben at the age of 17 is going to violate this contract. Ben gave his word. And even when James creates a secret contract, Ben still gave his word to that. And for Franklin to so easily break his contract tells us a little bit about Ben. You know, for our old Puritan friends, a contract was not simply an obligation between two or more people involved in a contract in this world. It was also a promise to God. It's almost like for the Puritans, God was a co-signer on every contract. Okay. But Ben very easily, very casually, sort of breaks this contract and doesn't think much of it. Doesn't feel guilty about it at all. So, Ben's in a different headspace than our old friends, the Puritans. Well, Ben's 17 and he's free, but he has some problems now. Okay. Problem number one, he doesn't have a job. Okay. And James is going to guarantee things are going to stay that way. Immediately after Ben quits, James goes to every other printer in Boston. He knew all these guys. And tells them, hey, don't hire my little brother. All right. He probably told him the circumstances, at least in terms of just, Ben being a dishonest person that you cannot trust, that you do not want to bring into your printing house. And sure enough, when Ben goes around to all the printers in Boston, they're all like, no, we heard about you. We're not interested. No, thank you. So Ben can't find a job in printing in Boston. Problem number two, everybody in the family sides with James. Okay. They don't disown Ben. They don't hate Ben, but they all tell Ben, hey, you got to go back and work for your brother. And, we could imagine Ben tried to spin it to all of them. Oh, but he's a bad boss. Oh, I didn't really have an apprenticeship with him. It was a secret contract. It wasn't a real contract. And nobody in the family was buying it. Everybody's like, yeah, whatever, dude. Go back and work for your brother. You're obligated to him till 21. Go back and work for him. So they didn't hate him. They still loved him. They didn't disown him. But he's not getting a lot of support from the family. Problem number three. When James was in jail, Ben actually did run the newspaper. He actually did print up copies of the New England Courant. And in particular, Ben was attacking authorities for arresting his brother. Okay. Despite Ben and James fighting, they were still brothers, and they still loved each other. And some of you, I suspect, could recognize this dynamic in your own personal life with your siblings. You might fight like cats and dogs with your brother or your sister, but if anybody outside of the family tries to get at your brother or sister, like, you guys are like this again. Like, you guys can fight with each other, but if anybody else steps to your sibling, it's on. And that's kind of what happened with Ben. Like, it made him mad his brother was thrown into jail. So Ben started writing all kinds of critical things, to which political authorities started warning him, telling Benjamin Franklin, really? Do you not see what has happened to your brother? Do you want to be in a jail cell next to your brother for the things you're writing in this newspaper? Knock it off, Benjamin Franklin. So the third problem was Franklin was on the radar of political authorities in Boston. He was getting a reputation. This was making him nervous. Okay. And then finally, number 4. This is wild. At this time, Benjamin Franklin is still a deist. And he's not only convincing his friends to abandon their Christian religious faiths and become a deist at this point. He's also just walking out on the streets and trying to convince people he doesn't know. One of those things that Benjamin Franklin reads in a book that he finds very interesting is this idea of the Socratic method. The Socratic method is named after the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates. Socrates believed the biggest problem in life was, or not necessarily the biggest problem in life, but the biggest problem in acquiring knowledge was that people believed they already knew things. They already thought they knew everything. And if you know everything, then you're not receptive to learn new things. And so Socrates argued the first step in true knowledge and true wisdom is admitting you don't know something. Once you admit you don't know something, then you can learn. But Socrates believed this was often the most difficult step in the process of learning. It's just to get people to admit they don't know something. If you've ever been a passenger in a car with somebody driving and the driver is lost but will not admit they are lost, you know what Socrates is talking about. You're pleading with the driver, pull over, there's a gas station right there. Let me go ask them where the entrance to the 405 freeway is. And the driver's like, no, I know where we're going, and they're clearly lost, and they just won't admit it. The first step in learning, in wisdom, of getting onto the freeway for this person would simply be to admit, I don't know. And once the driver admitted they don't know, you roll down the window, you ask somebody, you've arrived at enlightenment. So this was the big problem, admitting you don't know something. And so Socrates famously walked around ancient Athens as a teacher saying, I know nothing. I know nothing. But he would also admit, but this is why I'm probably smarter than you, because you think you know everything and you don't, but I'm learning. I know nothing. All right? And so the first step towards wisdom is admitting you don't know something. The Socratic method is, in terms of the actual method itself, is the repeated use of questions to elicit better and better answers until you get to a point where your answer is so good it can't be challenged by any question. And so, for example, in the humanities in which I teach in, when you go to graduate school in the humanities, often small seminars can be based on the Socratic method, where the professor doesn't lecture, but rather the professor simply asks students questions. You just ask questions and students respond and they give answers. And you ask more questions. Okay, this is how Socrates worked as a teacher in ancient Athens. He would ask his students questions, and when they would offer answers, he would ask them pointed questions in responding. He wouldn't tell them necessarily they're wrong. He would just ask them a question that would expose some sort of internal weakness with their answer and make them realize, oh, that's a good question. I can't answer it. My initial answer must be wrong. Okay. Franklin loved the Socratic method when he read about it. Because one of the aspects of the Socratic method is it tends to be non-confrontational. You're not telling somebody they are wrong. You're simply asking questions. All right. And if you ask the right questions, it gets the person to realize on their own that their answers are weak, if not totally wrong. And therefore, you didn't tell them they're wrong. You just exposed their wrongness by asking questions. Franklin loved the Socratic method. And so while he was a deist, he would go out on the streets of Boston and use the Socratic method by simply start asking people questions about their religious faith. And then continue to ask questions in ways that would expose weaknesses of their belief. And while doing so, try to lead them by the questions he was asking to come towards deism. That's what he was doing. Okay. Hey, remember before when I was saying this isn't the United States of America at the time we're talking, that there's no Constitution, that there's no Bill of Rights, that there's no guarantee of freedom of speech? Hey, nor was there any freedom of religion. We talked about this with the Puritans, right? The Puritans did not believe in religious freedom. So Ben walking around Puritan Boston trying to talk people out of their religious views was risky. Okay, it wasn't as risky if you were doing this in a little town like Denham. Right? This was a big, this was the big city where things were a bit looser. But he was still taking a risk. And Ben admits to us, people started accusing him of being a heretic in Boston. And so this is another reason why Ben's going to feel like he has to leave Boston, right? He can't find a job. His family is sided against him. Political authorities are looking suspiciously at him, and he's developed a reputation as a heretic because he's been walking around Boston trying to talk people out of their religious views. Ben's got to get the hell out of Boston. Right? And so that's what he determines to do. He decides to leave Boston. That's a good place to stop. In our next lecture, we'll talk about how Franklin ends up in Philadelphia and his early life in Philadelphia. Okay, that's it, everybody. I'll see you next time. Bye.